Did someone start recording? Mara? Welcome all. We'll be getting started in just a few. Hello and welcome to the 2023 PI Conference. We will get started in just a moment. Spanish interpretation is available for this session. You can access the Spanish language line by clicking the world link on your Zoom toolbar. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Freetong Mafor. I will be your moderator for today's session. I'm excited to welcome Hannah Davison and Morgan Shimluck, who will be leading an enlightening group discussion on emerging lessons and themes from genetic counseling in PI. There will be a time for questions at the end of the presentation. Please submit all questions you have for our presenters in the Q&A section of the platform. Please note that our guest labeled as technician is here to assist in recording today's session. If you have any IT questions as an attendee, please visit the help desk in your attendee hub. Today's session is sponsored by Farming. We are grateful for their ongoing support of our education and learning opportunities. I want to welcome Hannah Davison. Sorry, excuse me about that. Excuse me, sorry about that. I would like to welcome Hannah Davison as a genetic counseling trainee at the Johns Hopkins NIH Genetic Counseling Training Program. She previously completed a bachelor's degree in maternal health at Hampshire College. She's interested in the patient experience and treatment management decisions of people with primary immune deficiencies, including quality of life with IVIG infusions, decisional processes with stem cell transplant, and reproductive decision-making when living with PI. In the future, she hopes to be involved with clinical and research activities in the PI community as it intersects with genetic medicine. Welcome, Hannah. I'd also like to welcome Morgan Shimluck. She is the lead genetic counselor and co-leader of the centralized sequencing program at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, National Institute of Health in Bethesda, Maryland, where she has worked since 2013. She received her master's degree in genetic counseling from Johns Hopkins Bloomingburg School of Public Health in 2010 and holds her board certification from the American Board of Genetic Counseling. Her work focuses on the development and evolution of a large clinical genomic research program now spanning multiple disease areas, along with the patient-centered research on those genomic services. Clinically, she's interested in the specialty of immune disorders, patient-proven communication, and adolescent healthcare transitions. Thank you for joining. Welcome, Hannah and Morgan.
Great. Thank you so much for that generous introduction. It's really a pleasure to be with you and to be with Hannah, my friend and colleague, talking to you about the things that we hear as genetic counselors working in this specialty. And it only feels appropriate to start with a sincere word of thanks because of the many, many families that have shared a little window into their lives with us over the years. It's from you all that we've learned nearly everything we know about how people navigate the challenges of having a rare chronic disease. So why don't you go ahead and advance to the next slide, Hannah? No disclosures for us, no conflicts of interest. Next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about the program at the NIH that I co-lead, and then some of our patient-centered research that helps provide additional data from our clinical experiences with families. And one of the ways that we try to think critically and learn about what people need and what's helpful for them. All right, next slide. Okay, so I co-lead a large sequencing program at the NIH. It started in immunology. My boss is Steve Holland, who's probably also talking at this conference, and we decided to do a really simple thing for all of the participants that came to see us in Bethesda, and that was to offer broad genetic testing with a comprehensive analysis that we share back with the families. I've included some of the technical steps here on this slide, which is just to say that if someone comes to us with CVID, we look in their genetic data for if there's a genetic explanation for their CVID. We also look for types of findings that are not primary diagnoses, something that in the field we call secondary diagnoses, where unrelated to your immune system, these are potentially life-altering diseases, but where treatment's quite good and treatment makes a difference for people. These are called secondary findings. We also issue negative reports for a lot of the families we work with where we don't understand what's going on. Or what role genetics might play, if any. And all of this goes on a written report, and we talk to families about it, with the goal being earlier diagnosis, ideally precision treatment, and even better than that, prevention. And now this next slide with the little rainbow boxes, this is basically my job in one picture. So that clinical pipeline facilitates research. On the left-hand side, you see a variety of research projects that are biomedical in focus. And so we're interested in things like defining new disease genes, or if we have lots of patients where we suspect that perhaps there's not a single gene, but it's the concerted effect of many dozens or hundreds of genes that is actually what's creating the susceptibility to infection or atopic disease or colitis in a given individual, other things along those lines. And then if you take your attention to the blue-purple boxes on the right-hand side, I'll just underscore that the genetic counseling team over the years have asked a variety of questions about patient experience with our genomic services, about illness experiences, about how people navigate their world and what we can do to help. And so this is what we do. Next slide. And the bottom line here is that we talk to lots of families. So this is my protocol. Got started in, 2017, and started enrolling at a clip at 2018, and talked to 1,000 or so families each year. Most of these families have PI or an inborn error of immunity, or that's what we suspect they have. Some people have other indications, but that's not the focus of right now. And you can see over the years, we changed our genetic test and then we return results back to families. The bottom line here is that we talk to a lot of people on our team, and it gives us a lot of opportunity to understand more about what's going on for folks, both medically and psychosocially. Next slide. So one of the questions that our team had to do with this concept of psychological adaptation to illness. And so what this means is like the extent to which someone can integrate their illness into their life and learn to come to terms with the implications it has medically, socially, emotionally, familially for them, and the sort of like intersecting world of mental health, because anxiety and depression related diagnoses are just really common for our patients, right? It is stressful and can be very depressing to be sick and to not have people understand what's going on. And so these were things that we wanted to learn more about directly from our patients, and something that's really not well represented in the literature. So there's been a fair amount of work documenting quality of life. It can be diminished when people have chronic illnesses such as PI, but we wanted to learn about that with a bit more of a focused lens to understand, what was at work there. Next slide. So to just, cue up this concept, I'll give you a brief tale of two patients hypothetically, right? You can imagine someone, will call her Heather, and she's been sick maybe since a teenager, and perhaps her illness has been challenging to manage. She's rolled through multiple trials of different types of medical management strategies. Some have worked better than others. She's had to reroute her career aspirations, her family goals, etc. And yet, over the years, she's found ways to experience, fairly high quality of life on a day-to-day basis. And that's not to say that some days aren't really awful, but that on the whole, she's doing quite well, and that she's integrated this into her life. And then on the flip side, you can imagine, or perhaps, or you've had times when you felt at the total other end of the spectrum, when you struggle mightily with all of the things that I was just describing, and that on a day-to-day basis, an individual might experience quite a bit of distress, anger, sense of hopelessness about their illness and about their future. And so we've talked to so many patients on either end of the spectrum and thousands of people in between, and you can't have those experiences with patients, right? Each story is profoundly personal. Each story is its own. You can't hear all of that and not wonder, next slide, what makes these people, what makes this different, right? Why do trajectories fold along these sort of different lines? What are the factors that either support someone who's able to adjust successfully over time to their illness, and folks who really get stuck and really get lost along the way? And critically, are there things that we can do as healthcare providers that support people's adaptation to their illness and their overall well-being? And I want to say their overall well-being as its own entity alongside their medical management, right? Because it's not just managing symptoms well, it's taking care of the whole person. And that's a distinction that I really, really care about. Next slide. So lots of people have studied over the last several decades concepts of adaptation and sort of related ideas. There are different theories about what the active ingredients are here. This is one of them that just says, people finding ways to experience control over their day-to-day lives is important. Making meaning out of their experience is important. Finding ways to feel good about themselves is important. There are other important things too, but this is sort of like some foundation around what some of the important pieces might be. This isn't exhaustive, but just to sort of help flesh out this concept a little bit more, because I know it can be a bit vague. Next slide. And so as a jumping off point for this study, we sent a survey via email to 1,000 adults that are enrolled in my protocol and had them fill out 85 questions about how they were doing. These questions were all validated in the ways of this, this type of science. So it gave us some confidence that we were measuring something real and that we were wanting to measure, and ask them questions about demographics, about their illness, about their mental health, their day-to-day functioning, fatigue, sleep, pain, their perceptions of the control that they had over their illness, both historically, like the cause of their illness, as well as like the control that they feel presently and looking forward into their future. And then this concept of adaptation. Next slide. Of those 1,000 people, about 300 responded. Average age was 48, a bit more than half were women. 82% were white, non-Hispanic. And then you can see here in these pie charts, about half of the people we talked to had a known genetic cause for their illness. About half did not or were unsure. Most of the people we talked to had their illness for more than 10 years, and a sizable minority had undergone bone marrow transplant. Next slide. And so specifically thinking about this adaptation scale, because that's going to be the jumping off point for the next study that Hannah's going to talk about, we asked people questions such as, on a scale of 1 to 10, my illness has helped me learn to deal better with uncertainty. Or on a scale of 1 to 10, my illness has helped me learn to handle difficult times, or become closer to the people I care about, or reflect differently on the meaning of my life. And these are things that we hear over and over again, in different flavors to different tunes when we take care of people clinically at our hospital. But we really wanted the opportunity to sort of survey across a large group of patients and understand how this plays out in that sort of cross-sectional, data-driven way. Next slide. And so of the 300 people that responded, you can see this, it's not quite a bell curve, but that we have people all the way over to the right. You can see the smiley face, a number of people that are getting the maximum score. So these are the people like the sort of archetypal person I gave an example with, who said, yes, my illness has helped me in all of these ways. It's been inconvenient, definitely, but it's helped me with my relationships and with my understanding of myself, et cetera, et cetera. And then you can see all the way on the other side, a significant minority of participants who endorsed next to none of those same items. And then lots of people in the middle, with the average being right around just the numeric value of 4. And this is important because we decided to do a deep dive with folks that are on the right side of the screen to understand more about how they have achieved these perspectives over time. And Hannah's going to talk about a little bit more of that. And then next slide, sort of simultaneously in the survey, we just captured a snapshot of how people's self-report of anxiety and depression in the last 2 weeks. And anxiety and depression are prevalent in the general population, and also prevalent in this population recruited from my sequencing protocol, where about 8% of our respondents reported with what we would consider responses that are suggestive of severe depression or severe anxiety. And this absolutely makes everything harder, right? It's harder to take care of yourself, to follow through with recommendations, to have a sense of goals for the future, just everything. And anyone who's experienced this, this can be just really debilitating for folks. And this is a sort of another piece of the puzzle that we care about being seen when we're trying to understand the whole picture, and not just someone's infections or related PI symptoms. Next slide. So with this, I'm going to segue over to Hannah, and I just want to recognize that with this survey, what we did was sort of laid the foundations of getting a little bit of data on a lot of people. So we learned just a bit about sleep, pain, perceptions of control, anxiety, depression, adaptation, etc. But then we wanted to create opportunities to listen more deeply and ask more pointed questions about people's processes and how their lives has unfolded and the perspectives they had. And that's using a different method that now Hannah will tell you about.
Thank you so much, Morgan. So yeah, as Morgan has described, We really wanted to achieve some depth, in individual experiences from what people were sharing on the survey. And so in order to do that, we designed an interview study that explored how individuals adapt to their illness over time, and how this adaptation plays out over the life cycle for specific individuals based on their accounts. And we also wanted to understand how this adaptation process interacts with the depression and anxiety that was seen in some of the people who responded to that survey. And so we did this by completing an interview study. We contacted 35 participants who had initially responded to the survey. These individuals were between the ages of 18 and 40 years old, and they had scored at above average adaptation. So we wanted to look at, people who were in that sort of higher, score on that adaptation space. But we also wanted to be exploring these conversations with people who were in that space while also endorsing mild depression or anxiety on that previous survey. And ultimately, we heard back from about half of those 35, so 20 total, of the people who we spoke with. Common diagnoses for folks included GATA2 deficiency and common variable immune deficiency. And the average age of our interviewees was 32 years old. And just over half of the people who we spoke with were female, and a little over a third had undergone a stem cell transplant. And I really want to emphasize that, as part of this project, we really ultimately spoke with folks from all walks of life. And from that diversity, what we really found was that there were all of these themes that we saw coming up over and over again in the conversations that we had. And so, what participants described when speaking with us included evolving relationships to their perspective and worldview, experiences of disrupted goals over their lifetime, experiences of meaning making. They also described the influences of social context, a perceived sense of control, and structural barriers on their ability to adapt to their condition. And of course, we don't have time to talk about the details of each of these themes today. So what I'm going to do is briefly go into a little detail on what participants had to say regarding the meaning making piece, as well as evolving perspectives. So first, we saw a few ways participants described their perspective on illness as changing over time. Some participants described moving from resisting their illness through denial or guilt or extreme distress to accepting its role in their life. Seen from what this person shares, which is there's no reason why I should be well if other people are sick. There's no reason as to why things happen to certain people and not to others. So there's no point in thinking my life should be different. My life is just this way. This is my thing, the mountain I'm climbing. Everyone has their own. So kind of like, I guess, a self-awareness and humility and acceptance. Second, we saw participants refusing to define themselves by their illness, instead limiting its place in their life. As seen by this person who shares, healthy relationships help change my mindset a bit and get me to realize, yeah, I am sick. Yeah, that's fine, but that's not all that I am. That's a part of my life, but it's not my entire life. So I can make a life beyond a hospital bed. And finally, several participants expressed that learning to live with their illness ultimately cultivated a sense of gratitude that lifted them out of despair. As seen by this person who said that instead of seeing how much it's impacted them, they now see how much it impacts how they see other situations. When you have a chronic illness, you don't take moments for granted as much because some days are really good and some days are really bad. So you learn to capitalize on the good days and to appreciate the good days, and also just not get rattled as much by little things that don't matter. And so these cognitive attitudes developed over time living with their PI, supporting the idea that time can really alter someone's perspective on what it's like to live with, chronic sickness, and particularly in the case of PI. When we asked participants if they felt a sense of purpose or meaning in their illness, they consistently came back to the idea of altruism and advocacy, and they described how living with an invisible illness kind of cultivated a sense of compassion and empathy towards others and motivated them towards advocacy in various forms, as well as sharing their stories and, in this case, contributing to research. And I'll also just say right now that with the next project I'm going to talk about, this is also something that I'm seeing from the people that I spoke with, that for them it really matters to be able to share their experience. And as a result, this is really a source of deep meaning for many people. As can be seen in this quote on this slide, where this person shares that there were a lot of times where they contemplated why this happened to them. And it kind of brought them to a point where they said that maybe this happened to them to help others get through the same times, that they've been able to help others while living with their condition. And I'll also say that this also may not be a surprising finding, given that this is a group of people who were willing to give 60 to 90 minutes of their time to speak on the phone with me and the other people who completed these interviews about some of these topics that we talked about. So as we wrap up this project, we have a few more steps that we're currently working on that we'd like to share. This has included following up with interviewees to review what we've found. And what we can share about that so far is that the feedback that we've received has been overwhelmingly positive. It appears that a lot of what we found really seems to resonate with many of the people that we spoke with. We'll also be curious to hear if it resonates with some of you on this presentation today. We're also hoping to turn an eye to what healthcare practitioners can learn from these findings. And then finally, we hope to expand on some of the additional data that isn't as closely explored in these interviews. And so this includes some of the insights on mental health, as we mentioned before, as well as reproductive decisions. And with that, I'll now transition into the last piece of our presentation, which is my thesis project focusing on PI and family planning. So my work on the prior study, I rotated with the NIAID centralized sequencing program last summer, and I'm in my second year of a genetic counseling program, inspired me to kind of explore some of the reproductive considerations in greater depth with some of our participants. In the prior interview study, even when these were really brief conversations, they highlighted a lot of the ways that family planning can be complicated when somebody has a PI. Some of these complicating factors that we know of include difficult treatment decisions that can impact fertility, particularly stem cell transplant. When stem cell transplant's being considered as part of someone's care, fertility preservation may go hand in hand. This is when we essentially store sperm or eggs to be used at a future date for creating an embryo and helping facilitate a pregnancy. Beyond treatment decisions, there are also complex genetic features of some PIs that may change how someone perceives their own risk or their child's risk. And broadly, we know from other areas of genetic medicine that people with genetic conditions may be unsupported or misunderstood when they seek out support for family planning. And they may even experience stigma, or in some cases, not be provided with all of their options. And so given all of this information, we wanted to understand how people with PI or any PIs are making sense of their family planning options. And we also wanted to understand what their care needs are to achieve their reproductive health goals. Now, just a caveat that this project is still very actively in process. We are still actively recruiting participants. And so today, we're sharing what I consider sort of an initial update of what we're beginning to see. And that means that the insights that we may ultimately have at the end of this project are subject to change or evolve a little bit. But that being said, we're still very close to completing this project. Our goal was to interview 25 people with one of several PIs who have varied perspectives on family planning. So we wanted to talk to a wide range of people, ranging from someone who knew they never wanted to have kids, to someone who knew they always wanted to have biological children, to people who want to adopt, to people who've used IVF in order to build their family. And so far, we've interviewed 19 people with 5 more interviews scheduled. While our sample of people we've talked to is predominantly female, I think it's important to note that our male participants are a really mighty minority in terms of their insights and what they've shared as part of this project. Men tend to be kind of underrepresented in a lot of reproductive decision-making research. And so we wanted to make sure to be able to talk with that group and get that perspective. And our interviewees range in age from ages 18 to 48. And I will also note that about 10 of the 19 people we've spoken to have had a stem cell transplant, while several others shared that a transplant may be a part of their future care. And although participants in this project have varied perspectives on family planning or family planning strategies, most have considered biological as well as non-biological ways of building a family at some point in their life. So that includes use of IVF, fertility preservation, adoption, as well as some people who have decided that they aren't going to have children of their own, but want to maintain an active presence in other children's lives as a non-parent. So what have we learned so far? From the interviews that we've done, there's a few overarching ideas that have come through. These include that PI impacts how someone thinks about family. Participants have also shared varied experiences with fertility preservation that I really wanted to highlight. And this, to me, indicates a need for personalized care in this arena and with people in this population. And finally, participants also have shared really complex, personal, and really distinctive meanings to having a genetic diagnosis for their PI. For many of our interviewees, family and PI are really inseparable concepts. In many cases, this was because of a significant family history of their condition, but also because many participants describe kind of weighing their lived experience and understanding about their condition, including that understanding through affected family members, kind of alongside their own personal capacity for being able to actively parent a child. In this quote from one interviewee, she describes in one breath how she could go from meeting her husband and envisioning this life together that included building a family, before subsequently experiencing a sequence of events due to her condition that, really ended up kind of foreclosing on that opportunity for her to have biological children. She kind of ends that quote with this remark that the not being able to have a family piece of living with her PI was the hardest part of all of what she went through. And to me, this quote really illustrates how these ideas about family and living with your condition can really bleed into each other. And, as I mentioned, with several participants experiencing a stem cell transplant or fertility preservation, one thing that's really stuck out to me is that there's been a variety of positive and negative experiences described that I wanted to kind of highlight as one of the first things we're seeing. When reading through these interviews, in many cases, fertility preservation was completed hastily or not at all given a participant's condition leading up to a stem cell transplant. One of the experiences described from the interview that really stood out was from this participant who described a discontinuing of fertility preservation support right before their stem cell transplant by their care organization. As this participant says, the conversation was just sort of dropped in a way that felt to her and her wife like their needs and the impact of losing this option just wasn't fully recognized by her care team. And I will say that sadly, this participant wasn't able to secure another option for fertility preservation before her transplant. And so the prior slide really shows how conversations about fertility preservation within the PI community can occur under many different contexts for people with certain forms of PI. However, across different care settings and points of receiving this kind of care, participants that I spoke with were really unified in their emphasis that the conversations around fertility preservation must be personalized. And with the example quotes I have on this slide, they're from two different participants who have two different gender identities, two very different experiences of their PI. But they also show contrasting experiences of the fertility preservation conversation. For both of these interviewees, it was important to have the option of fertility preservation, to have it be available, to be presented by their care team. But they had different values about their hopes for parenting, about living with PI, and also their experiences with providers and how they were treated with providers. And so for the providers who may be in the audience and at this conference, you may find that working with patients with PI who are pursuing any sort of fertility services require care that goes beyond a one-size-fits-all approach when considering this decision, which can be a very significant one for people and can also be something that just at minimum needs to be an option as part of people's care. Finally, this project also has provided an opportunity to talk to people about what it has meant for them to receive a genetic explanation for their PI, and how they're actively considering this when they contemplate their reproductive planning needs. From the interviews that we've done so far, it's clear that genetics provides answers and clarity to some degree. As the interviewee from the top quotation says, a genetic diagnosis may explain many or all of one person's symptoms. It may give them an answer. But this participant and others also are tremendously aware of the fact that many PIs present differently in everyone, even within the same family in many cases. And it's also not a far cry to think about the impacts of this to future offspring. And many participants have said as much when talking to me. Sometimes in very sophisticated terms that they're actively grappling with. In the case of this participant in the second quote, he was really actively grappling in our interview with, the promises and pitfalls of genetic technology. He made reference to the movie Gattaca when he was reflecting on this idea that, if you're taking out the natural, his way of describing doing gene editing or any sort of genetic changes, how much room is there for growth? He has this way that he's considering, are there negatives to being any sort of involvement in genetic editing? Does it set a limit on how far people can grow? And this is just one example of how people are kind of making sense of, the possibilities of the future, the possibilities of reproductive technologies, when living with their condition. So we're excited to see how some of these initial perspectives develop with our remaining interviews. Our goal is to wrap up this project over the course of this fall. Since it is my thesis project, it is something I will in some ways have to wrap up, for December completion. And as part of that, we'll reach out to the people that I spoke with, get their input on, some of the results that we find. But my hope is to, once I finish graduation, extend this project in some way to consider strategies for addressing some of the care needs in the reproductive health space that have been brought up by participants. And that concludes our presentation. We are excited to take questions, and we have many people to thank. I want to just personally thank Morgan because in addition to the other folks listed on my thesis committee, she has been a very steadfast supporter of my project from the beginning when it was just a couple of different ideas I was shaking around.
Thank you. Morgan and Hannah, thank you so much for leading such an insightful conversation. As Hannah just stated, we now have some time for Q&A. Before we begin, please remember that everyone's treatment and conditions are unique. The information presented during the session is not medical advice, nor is it intended to be a substitute for medical advice, diagnoses, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health providers with questions concerning your medical condition. So I'm just going to go over to our chat. I see there are a host of questions in here. Let's see here. Morgan, if you agree with me, I see a few questions here about getting about interest in the study, and Morgan shares this in the chat. For those who are interested in learning more about the study, you'll need to be referred by your doctor to the NIH PID clinic. Again, the link is in the chat. After that, their genetic team will then provide evaluation and counseling as part of their PI, as part of your PID clinical workup. Now, we do have a question here which states epigenetics describes epigenetics describes chemical modifications to DNA that may alter gene expression without altering the DNA sequence itself. On the other side, genetic mutations remain fixed throughout one's life. In your opinion, and in relation to your observations, what lifestyle behaviors, choices, races, socioeconomic status, environments, et cetera, impact epigenetic changes related to PI or IEI the most? What research are you interested in the most in the future related to particular impact factors that affect PI or IEI?
It's a big question. Maybe I might paraphrase a little bit to I guess communicate how I experience this most directly in my role. Nobody's the same, right? It varies. The same disease can look really different in two individuals, just like you were saying 2 minutes ago, that, everybody's disease is different. Even in the same family that has the same underlying genetic disease, you can have one child that just has every complication under the sun and someone else who has a relatively smooth path and just fewer symptoms, less severe, et cetera. And you can't sit with that family and not ask these questions about what makes the difference here. And relatedly, I think this brings forward a lot of questions about prognosis. And one might look around at other people who have the same disease in their family, or that they know, one way or another, and say, they're so much worse than I am, or I'm so much worse than they are. And, how is this going to unfold over time for me? And I wish that we were able to give better guidance to people in this regard. And very often we're not. And it's part of the uncertainty that is just so baked into the illness experience of so many of our patients. All of that said, we know a tiny bit about some of these things. There's epigenetics, which is fascinating, and we don't understand it that well. There's also somatic variation. So these are genetic mutations that people accumulate during their life. And we know that this can contribute to severity of disease, particularly for, to use one example, GATA2 deficiency. When individuals develop problems with their bone marrow, that's very often due to accumulated mutations that occur in their bone marrow and then lead to bone marrow failure and other sort of related problems, as one example. And why people develop those particular mutations in those particular cells is not well understood. I think to take a couple steps back and look at it from another perspective, there's a big literature that's really evolved over the decades and has been really resilient to sort of new understandings of science. It's all summed up in the hygiene hypothesis. And that's basically, it's a bit of a misnomer because it's really not about any individual's personal hygiene practices, but really about industrialization. And as people have fewer, particularly early life experiences related to pathogens in our world, their immune system perhaps misses opportunities to attune to what's friend and what's foe. And then correspondingly, there's epidemiological, meaning looking over whole large industrial populations. Industrial is maybe not necessary there, but populations in lots of different cultures across time and across continents. A corresponding rise in allergic disease and atopic disease, like atopic dermatitis, eczema, allergies, and also autoimmune disease, common disease like rheumatoid arthritis and many other things as well. And so you might see this, right? Or you might know that when I was a kid, bad peanut allergies weren't common, and I have kids now, and almost every school and summer camp are pretty tuned into nut allergies, and so you can't bring peanut butter sandwiches to most places. That may not be true everywhere, but that's just one example of the prevalence of food allergies and people's awareness of this. And I think some of that is awareness, and some of that is a truly increased prevalence in allergic disease and atopic disease and autoimmune disease that's really resilient. And so that's not entirely about epigenetics, but perhaps a background factor that's happening at a sort of generational scale that might be shaping the immune system of our communities. I don't know, Hannah, do you have other things that you want to add to the topic of epigenetics?
I think you really beautifully summed up everything that I could potentially think about with that. I guess maybe the one thing that I'll also add, even though it's maybe not immediately related to epigenetics, but I'm thinking about with risk factors, one thing in genetic counseling that, and Morgan's group is doing some work with this, but they're focusing more on its involvement in mental health, is that, we have this sort of metaphor that we use, that we talk about this sort of like the cup model or jar model. And so the idea is that, we have all these different risk factors that we are all encountering, some of which are genetic that we may be born with, and some of which are, environmental, and are maybe in this space where they are modifying. And we've started using that as something that can be helpful for talking about modifiable factors in people's lives with patients. That has been a really interesting thing for me as a student to use, and a lot of times it gets used when we talk about mental health factors with patients. But I do think that it's been surprising to see kind of the different, for me, I'm always really interested in meaning that people apply to their condition. And it's been really surprising to see when people see that model kind of presented, how it helps them kind of make sense of, the idea of something that's modifiable versus not, versus, things that are kind of in that like gray area.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm actually going to ask this. I have a feeling you may have already alluded to this answer, but I'll ask. Do you think that couples in which one or both individuals involved have a PI or IEI should have to go through genetic counseling, or to go over everything before IVF or fertility options are made available to them?
Morgan, is it okay if I answer that?
Yeah.
Kind of jump in with answering that. So I really appreciate, all of the questions that people have had, but I think this is a really interesting one, in part because, I think that the decision to, one of the things that we learn kind of as part of our training as genetic counselors is that the decision to pursue genetic testing is often a very personal one. And I think that that is even more so the case when you are talking about whether it's a hypothetical child or a child that you are expecting, or again, even if you're just in the place where you're doing like any consideration around having a family, I think that it's an option people should have access to. One thing that has come through in a lot of the conversations I've had is that there is a difference between access on like at its own sort of like, do you have the ability to actually get in to see a genetic counselor versus like, is the person who's going to sit across from you going to understand your specific condition, going to understand your experience of living with a PI. And then that is completely separate from the fact that, you know, in the broader care system, and this is the case for folks with PI, but this is also something that I've seen in a lot of the reproductive and family planning literature, that I think in general in healthcare, we have a long ways to go in terms of actually being able to create systems that support people in making decisions for themselves about, you know, their reproductive health. And so I feel like there's a lot of different layers to this, but we have a lot of work to do. And that specifically for folks with PI, ideally, I would love for people to have that option and have the ability to access like good quality care that includes genetic testing or discussing options related to their reproductive health. And I recognize that that is, unfortunately, from what's just come through in some of the conversations I've had so far, not always the case for everybody.
Awesome. It's like, do we have one more question? Oh, nicely said. Thank you so much, Morgan and Hannah. We really appreciate you. Our time together has come to an end. Thank you so much to all those who joined us for today's session. This session is one of 39 unique learning opportunities provided through our 2023 PI conference. We hope you continue tuning in today as we explore other critical topics for the PI community. And again, thank you to our partner Farming for supporting this learning opportunity. Have a great day and enjoy tomorrow's conference. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much, guys.